Greetings, Trinity community. We're back with Trinity Reads Amos Chapter 6 this week, and I'm excited for you to hear our upper school teacher, Topher Thomas, who's also a diversity liaison in the upper school, interview Dr. Brent Strawn talking about Amos Chapter 6. And listen especially for their discussion of the woes in this chapter, the woes in Amos, and how they connect with the words of Jesus in the Gospels. Thanks for being part of this. Non nobis.
I'm Topher Thomas. I am an upper school faculty member as well as the upper school diversity liaison, and I lead our peer mentorship program in the upper school. And today we are here talking about Amos chapter 6. And so I'm here with Brent, and Brent, I have just a few questions I want to ask you, and I'm ready to jump right in if you are.
Yeah, let's go.
All right. So he starts off Amos chapter 6 with all these woes, and just begins talking about the complacency of the people. And I want to know, one, just what is the importance of this type of speech, this form of speech? And also, he talks about those who are at ease, those who are notable. And what does that mean for us as a Trinity community? Being where we are, many of us are affluent. What does this have to do with us?
Yeah. No, those are great questions. I think the woe language or alas language ties in with what we read earlier in chapter 5 when Amos raises up a word of lamentation, which is as Luke Powery said in last week's episode, this is funeral language. It's sort of like a lament over someone who's died, only in Amos's case, the nation hasn't yet died, but he's speaking to them as if they've already died. And this language of alas is that same sort of thing. Oh, woe for you. It's kind of like the woes that Jesus speaks in the Gospels too. So this is language, it's doom. In fact, some modern translations translate that little Hebrew word as doom. Doom on those who are at ease in Zion, because that's what's coming. So that's part of it. That second piece that you mentioned, the second question about the affluence and the luxury and whatnot, and its application to us. I mean, it is applicable to many of us, and really to all of us to some degree in the first world compared to the rest of the world, where so much of the world's wealth is housed in the first world and places like North America. And it does really hit close to home. At that point, Amos isn't just preaching, he's meddling. He's meddling with our finances. Right. And Jesus does that sort of thing too all the time. That gets us a little nervous, and we don't like that. But we got to hear it, because here it is in Scripture, and here it is from the prophet of God. And what Amos says, I think, is really stunning in relationship with verse 1 and then verse 7. He's talking about people who love to be first, And we all kind of want to be first, right? They love to be first. The notables are the first of the nations. And then in verse 7, therefore they shall now be the first to go into exile. You want to be first? First shall be last. I read that somewhere. So that's a couple things that come to mind about that.
Yeah. When I was reading these woes, and he talks about some really specific things. Those who lie on beds of ivory. I love the poetry of it all. Stretch themselves out on couch. I think about just the comfort. And I'm not wealthy by any stretch, but I am comfortable. And this really, I read this, and my gut reaction is like, this doesn't really apply to me. I don't really need to be uncomfortable. It's fine to be comfortable. But I really do think there is an extent to which we really do need to actually lay down some of our financial resources. We need to push ourselves to give some of that up. And I think it's so easy to just say, no, it's fine. I've earned this. I've worked for this. This is mine. I can have it.
Right.
When the prophets, they're there to push back on that idea and say, no, it's not.
Right, I think that's exactly right, and it's picked up in the prophetic acts and speeches of Jesus, right? I mean, in various verses that come to mind. But I think that one of the key things to keep in mind too is this verse 6b in particular, because you're right. I mean, oh, alas for those who lie on beds of ivory, lounge around, want music, Spotify whenever they want, et cetera, drink wine, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. I mean, that's the key thing there in that verse. You got all the wealth and comfort you want, and you don't care a thing about how Joseph, which is this poetic term for the northern kingdom, is ruined. I mean, that's the problem right there. Right. It's the affluence that turns into affluenza, and a lack of care, a lack of concern for anyone else except yourself. Right. I only care about my stock portfolio or my house or whatever. I'm not caring about others. And if you care about the ruin of Joseph, you're going to be like you said, you're going to be caring about others, not just the portfolio, not just your comfort. Yeah. And of course, if we're comfortable, we don't want to be uncomfortable, right? I mean, that's it. So that's why Jesus said harder to go for a camel through the eye of the needle.
Right. Because the wealth almost kind of becomes like a blinder where you don't want to look out and see. I think about even the Good Samaritan, how they kind of walked on the other side.
That's right.
We don't want to see the one who's hurting. We don't want to see.
That's right.
Because that causes guilt. That causes a lot of things. And maybe we do have to give something up. And in that case, he ends up bringing him over. He pays for his health care and everything else. And
that costs him some. Yeah. And it related to that, isn't it? There's this notion that runs throughout Amos of idolatry, right? And I think you get that, at least a hint of it in verse 13, where Amos says, you don't care anymore about justice and righteousness. Instead, you rejoice in lo debar, which in Hebrew really could mean nothing. It could be a place name, or it could mean you just rejoice in nothing. You don't care about anything that really matters. You just, whatever. And then you say, have we not by our own strength done this? So either you're kind of worshiping nothing or you're just worshiping self. Either one's idolatrous, and Amos is against that. That's a replacement of the true Lord with a fake, and that's verboten. When it comes to biblical faith. And so anything that we do, our trust in ourselves, our wealth, our power, our skill, our talent, whatever, insofar as it competes with the fundamental trust in the Lord, who will brook no rivals, the first commandment, right? No other gods besides me. Then we got a problem.
Yeah, that's good. So he continues on in the chapter and begins talking about these comparisons to other cities. Can you just tell us a little bit about why Amos is telling the Israelites to compare themselves to these other cities?
Yeah, verse 2 is kind of a tricky one in Amos, and there's different opinions on why these two places, or actually three, right? The Calneh, Hamath, and Gath of the Philistines, why they're mentioned. Some people think that Amos is quoting what these notables are saying, and that they think, oh, these places aren't as good as we are. And so there's a quotation here, which then he rebuffs. The other option, which I think is more common nowadays and is reflected in at least in the NRSV translation, is that what's going on in verse 2 is that Amos is pointing out these other places that have been destroyed. And say, oh, you think you're better, but check it out. Look at those places, that one, and that one. All of them have experienced destruction. And in Amos's terms, that would be divinely wrought. They've experienced that. You're no better than them. It's coming for you. The day of the Lord is coming for you. That's what he ends with in verse 5, in chapter 5.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That makes me, in light of that, thinking about kingdoms getting destroyed, and I'm thinking about our cultural moment right now, and not just COVID, the racial unrest, and just the unease that I know I'm feeling, certainly in America right now, as we've seen ourselves as this great power for so long, and American exceptionalism.
Right.
Does this, would you say it speaks into kind of what we're experiencing now, and how does it do that?
For sure it does, right? And it does it on multiple levels, I think. And it's something that Estelle and I talked about, at least briefly, I think, with reference to chapter 4. And that is that, on the one hand, Amos, to me, speaks primarily a word to the people of God. And, oh, alas, you people of God who are among the wealthy and all the rest, who stretch out on and don't care about the ruin of Joseph, don't care about the ruin of America, don't care about the lower classes, don't care about the oppressed, don't care about economic disparity. Woe to you, right? Cows of Bashan. Things are coming. A day is coming, and don't think it's a great day of the Lord's deliverance. It's a great day of God's judgment on all that is high and lofty, So that to me is a real stunning wake-up call to the Christian church, to people of faith, to say, which side are you on? At the end of the day, according to Amos, there's just two sides.
Yeah.
There's God's side of justice and the other side. And you better be on the right side, or else it's exile, it's destruction, it's fire, etc. So that's one word. The other word is that God cares, according to Amos, about societal ills writ large. And these have a kind of personality, if you will, a kind of life of their own. And whether it's Moab or Edom or Israel, God cares about justice in the gate. God cares about whether poor people can get a fair hearing in court, whether or not they are taken advantage of by the rich, cares about whether or not people are living righteous lives within their own families, let alone within. Justice and righteousness, these are the leitmotifs, the key words over and over again, and they connect in every level, to the highest levels of courtroom, boardroom, to the smallest levels of how we treat each other and how we treat people we don't know. And so to me, these are the two ways that Amos does speak to the present moment in powerful ways.
That's good. I want to keep on moving through the text. And he talks about, starting verse 8, just read it. The Lord God has sworn by himself, declares the Lord God of hosts. I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his strongholds, and I will deliver up the city and all that is in it.
Yeah.
Those are strong words.
Those are
God hates.
About as strong as you can get.
Abhors pride.
Yeah.
So my question, because we've been talking about the woes and the luxury, do wealth and luxury always lead to pride? That's kind of like the flow. It seems to just go from you have all this and I hate your pride.
Yeah. It is. It's just a stunning verse, and it's like what I said, I think, to Chip in one of the first weeks, that Kafka has a line that we need books that are like ice axes that break the sea frozen inside us, and Amos is like that book. We have a sea frozen inside of us about injustice and economic disparity because we like to be comfortable, etc. Amos comes in with this ice axe and says, enough of that, and breaks it up. And this verse is just one, right? But a perfect example of that. And what it's so stunning about the poetry of is it gets our attention, right? This is shocking language. God hates things. God's just not a God of love. God's a God of hate, right? God hates certain things, and God hates, in this verse, the pride of Jacob and its strongholds. So this poetic term now for the northern kingdom and all its strongholds. God hates all that. And of course, that goes back to chapter 5 about God hating the worship of the northern kingdom. And so I think that pride here of Jacob is a kind of poetic cipher. It's a kind of a word that evokes a lot of things that have already been going on in Amos. It's kind of another motto of the book, as it were, this little verse, with this little word standing in for everything that Amos is opposed to, that God is opposed to in Amos.
Right.
Arrogance, luxurious living at the expense of others, pride, but not just sort of pride as we think about it, as I think more highly of myself than I ought to, but all of these things that Amos has been decrying for 5 chapters, that's all sort of activated in pride. That's that word pride. That's what God hates and abhors, in fact. And because of it, the city days are numbered, right? It's got a limited shelf life.
Yeah.
And we can think about that again in our present moment. Does our society have a limited shelf life? And is that because it is marked by unrighteousness that God can no longer stand? Does the church have a limited shelf life because it's been wrongly aligned with the powers that be, rather than the only power that ultimately matters?
Right. When Jesus came, and when he started his ministry, so many of his attacks that were, really strong, really violent almost, were towards and to the religious establishment because of their pride.
Right.
Because they were simply trying to retain and maintain power.
Yeah.
That was the thing Jesus reacted to.
Yeah.
I think of the woman caught in adultery. Jesus gives her nothing but kindness. but it's those Pharisees that he goes after.
He goes after them hard.
Matthew
23, that comes to mind, is that chapter where he's all the woes. That's the doom language. Yep. Woe to you hypocrites, you Pharisees, etc. And then it's fascinating because right after that he says all this, he says, fill up the measure of your ancestors, you snakes, you brood of vipers. How can you escape being sentenced to hell? I mean, Jesus said that's stunning language too. Then at the end of that chapter, he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. I mean, that's what he wants.
That's what he wants.
But you were unwilling. That's what he says. And so what's really striking about that, I think it corresponds to Amos. What's going on with Amos is God angry about who can keep you from being sentenced to hell. And that here's my servant Amos on his way, because I would love to just gather you back into under my wings. Seek the Lord and live. That's chapter 5. Don't seek those other things. Seek me and live.
Right. Oh, that's good. That's good. So right after that continues into verse 9, and these are really tricky verses. So I'm just going to read them to you, and I want for you to help us to understand.
I'll try.
He says, and if 10 men remain in one house, they shall die. And when one's relatives, the one who anoints him for burial, shall take him up and bring the bones out of the house, and shall say to him, who is in the innermost parts of the house? Is there still anyone with you? He shall say, no. And he shall say, silence. We must not mention the name of the Lord. What is happening?
What is that about? It's one of those places it's not clear, right? Well, we need a little help. And, again, there's different options of interpretation, of course, and scholars have devoted time to this. Biblical scholars got to have something to do, right? They got to have some tricky verses to figure out. I think at least a couple things come to mind. One is that in chapter 5, verse 3, we had an interesting verse where God talks about a law of diminishing returns in terms of judgment. A city that marched out 1,000, it was only going to have 100 left. Yeah. And then one who marched out 100 will only have 10 left. You have a drastic reduction. Now you got 10 people left in chapter 6, verse 9, and then there's going to be 0 left. So on the one hand, again, it's a little vignette that illustrates the stunning comprehensiveness of God's judgment. That's one thing that we could say. It's evidently someone's coming into a house to retrieve a deceased body and remove it, and asks if there's anybody else in the house or any other deceased person. And the answer is evidently no other deceased people in there. And then the person says, don't say anything else. Because oftentimes you would say you would say the Lord's name as a part of that. No, there's no other dead people in this house. Thanks be to God, or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And this person says, don't mention God's name. Why wouldn't they want to mention God's name? It seems that this judgment that's envisioned here is so palpably from God that it's don't mention God if you don't have to, in case God comes back after us again. Let's just keep it quiet. Hush. Don't mention the Lord's name. That's kind of, on the one hand, hard for us to wrap our minds around. On the other hand, can you imagine what life would be like if we actually believed the presence of God was that palpable, and also that potentially mobilized against us if we're not living the right way?
Right.
We would be different people. Our world would be a different place.
Right. It's frightening.
It's frightening.
And I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to marry that image of Christ as the hen, bringing in the children, wanting to protect, wanting to save, with this image of, don't say anything about God. God's going to come get us.
Yeah.
And so, do you have some help in terms of how do we unite those two pictures?
Well, I think we unite them with a larger biblical imagination. I mean, I think all these things resonate across the canon in various ways if we have ears to hear. I mean, I think of Jesus saying, don't swear by heaven or by earth. You don't need to be mentioning God's name. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. But I also think of this passage in Matthew 23, and it's not just there. I mean, Jesus has got lots of brutal, wrathful, judgmental things to say throughout the Gospels, and Paul continues the vein, in that vein, and the book of Revelation certainly does. But I think that to see somehow, and it's true, in the biblical vocabulary, God's wrath is never an end to itself. It's employed for therapeutic purposes. That that Christ says, who can keep you from being sentenced to hell in Matthew 23? I would have gathered he's the one who could keep you from being sentenced to hell, but you were unwilling. See? So, who's the problem, right, in the scenario? It's not the Lord, it's not Christ, it's us.
Yeah.
And so I think in that sense, there's no contrast at all, but rather remarkable congruence and coherence, resonance between what Amos is saying and what we see in the New Testament. That these things matter. These things matter, and pick your poison in Matthew 25, a couple chapters later, right? Eternal fire, if for the goats versus the sheep that go on to glory. Pick your poison. You want eternal fire, or do you want the sword of Amos and whatnot? It's the same thing. It's the same result, and it's the same matter and issue at hand, which is God's care for those who aren't being cared for, and it's on us if we don't care for them.
I think it's just so necessary to just remember that this language, the violence that we see, it all stems from a care, like you were just saying. It stems from God's care.
That's right.
And that's why.
That's right.
That's why he says these things.
It's a prophetic if or perhaps.
Right.
If you turn, perhaps. If you turn, it's an option. It's a moment. It's a window in which we can change our ways, and that's grace.
That's grace. That's good. So in verse 12, Amos mentioned something he also mentioned in chapter 5 about turning justice into wormwood. He says, "But you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood," is the way he puts it. So one, what does that mean is one part of my question. Then also, are there ways that we as a Christian community can kind of tend to do that as well?
Well, the poetic line here puts poison kind of comparable, makes poison comparable to wormwood. Wormwood is a plant, a bitter plant that grows in Palestine and elsewhere in the world. And it's not technically poison, but it doesn't taste good. And so what Amos is upset about, God and Amos is upset about, is that these sublime virtues of justice and righteousness are being, made into their worst opposites. No one cares about those anymore. It's turned justice into poison, righteousness into wormwood. So it's this ultimate devaluation, profanation of these sublime virtues that are to mark the people of God and that mark God's own persona in the Bible. God is holy and righteous and just. So that's one thing. I think your second question, Amos would say we do this sort of thing all the time, right? In the ways he says.
Right.
Insofar as we don't care about justice, insofar as we trample righteousness down and don't attend to those things in the way he suggests, we're guilty of that same thing, of making it poison, turning it into wormwood, just not caring about other things more than the ruin of Joseph,
Right.
So I think that's a prescient point for us to stew on.
Yeah, no, that's good. That was my last question. I think so much of this chapter has to do, like you said, with caring. So much of the book of Amos and all the prophets, it's just, you don't care about the right things. It's just how God feels, and it's being expressed.
It gets to a point it can't be stopped anymore.
It can't.
God's reached the limit. And Amos, this little shepherd, who might, by the way, have learned a lot of what he knows from his family, his little clan in a tiny little town south of Bethlehem, brought up, as it were, in the fear of the Lord.
Right.
He's got it on his heart and on his mind because the Lord took him and said, "Go prophesy." It's been fun to chat with you, Topher.
It's been really fun. Yeah, do you have any final thoughts or?
No, I think you wrapped it up perfectly.
Okay.
I like that. Care about the right things. I'm going to remember that.
There you go.
Thanks a lot.
Love it. That was great.